for all the newcomers. I think we're just about ready to get started. We've got about a little over 50 people, so I think we can probably get this conversation started. I'm going to continue letting people in the waiting room in, but I guess I just want to say a quick intro and just say thank you all for being here, audience and guests. We're really excited to have all of you here for the first of our Bravely Curious conversation series. I'm Olivia Metke. I'm a fourth-year landscape architecture student, and I'll be one of the co-facilitators tonight, along with Adriana. So I'll pass it off to her to give you the rest of the intro.
Yes, hello everyone. I'm Adriana Sanchez. I'm also a fourth-year landscape architecture student and the other co-facilitator this evening. And to just echo Olivia, I'm just really grateful and overall excited to be here and be a part of this conversation. To kind of introduce Bravely Conversing, this series was created as a response to the open letter of the Department of Landscape Architecture for students for immediate and long-term changes to combat racism and anti-Blackness. So we are aiming to highlight the voices of BIPOC faculty across the university and engaging in interdisciplinary cross-pollination while encouraging meaningful sharing and inquiry through informal conversation. So taking up space in this white dominant field is an accomplishment in and of itself. And it's more than okay to acknowledge that. And so there are BIPOC faculty and professionals doing incredible work, and we need to increase student exposure to them in order to foster a climate of confidence in our students that this profession is a place for them. And to kind of get us started, I'd like to briefly introduce our guests. Dr. Álvaro Huerta, an associate professor in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning and the Department of Ethnic and Women's Studies, and Mr. Steven Chavez, lecturer in the Department of Landscape Architecture, licensed architect, and landscape architect, and founder of Steven Chavez Associates Landscape Architecture and NAMLA, the National Association of Minority Landscape Architects. So welcome. And I guess I'd like to start off asking you both to maybe share a little bit about yourselves and how we ended up in how you ended up in your professions and how you'd like to and what your focus has been recently.
Great. So I'll start a little bit about my trajectory. Actually, I'm half Chicano, half Tejano. My mom was Chicano. My dad is Tejano. So interesting combination. My mom was more like a free spirit, kind of hippie-ish, I guess you can say. My dad was this hardcore Tex-Mex, like cowboyish type. So I'm born and raised in the San Fernando Valley. I actually was born in Pacoima, in the projects in Pacoima, and lived in Pacoima until I was about 11 years old, and then moved to Panorama City, also in the Valley, Van Nuys, and then currently I'm living in Sherman Oaks. Never went to high school. I barely made it through junior high. I didn't like school. I ditched junior high with my friends all the time. And instead I ended up, getting my GED, right? Instead of having to go through 2 years of high school, I got my GED, started working on cars because my uncles were into cars. The community was into cars. I loved lowriders, I loved customs, and all I could afford was a Volkswagen, but I got Volkswagens and I started customizing Volkswagens. And so that led to a job working for a pretty well-known customizer named Gene Winfield in Canoga Park, California. And he's still working out in the Mojave Desert, and he's 90-something years old. He's been customizing cars since the 1950s. Then I had an auto accident, which made things a little difficult doing physical work. So I decided to go back to college. And initially I thought, well, I'll go into architecture. It's kind of a similar language, I guess you can say, proportion, materials, different, but kind of similar. And that's what I knew of. I didn't know much about landscape architecture. But then in community college, I took an environmental science course, and I loved environmental science course. And I thought, how can I combine the two? And then, I thought, well, what about landscape architecture? Somebody, David Stretfield at University of Washington did a lecture, and I was pretty much sold from that lecture. And so I got accepted, I applied and I got accepted to the University of Washington Landscape Architecture program. And while I was in the program, I worked part-time for a painter that did encaustic painting as an artist assistant. While I was in school, I did a practicum with a firm called Gustis and Guthrie Nickel in Seattle, and that led to contract work with them for a couple of years, which was a great experience. I learned a lot, worked on different scale projects, fast pace. But my mom was getting older, my family was back in LA, so I moved back to LA and started my own landscape design, home-based office. And while I was doing landscape design, mostly residential work, I studied for the LARs and got through the LAR exams, grading and drainage taking 3 attempts. So work was slow, and I've always loved photography. So I went back to school for a master's in fine art and photography, particularly with a focus on everyday landscapes, and to try to get a different perspective of landscape architecture from a photographer's lens. And it did change a lot of how I saw landscape architecture. I kind of see it as a lot of highly stylized stuff now when I look at it, after coming out of studying everyday functional landscapes. And then in 2018, I started teaching at UCLA Extension and also at Cal Poly Pomona in the fall of 2018. So from no teaching experience to teaching at both schools all at once. So it was quite a learning experience, but it was fun. And then in 2020, I started NAMLA with Sarah Abed, and that's still going. We got our 501c3 status. And I'm currently a Doctor of Design student at North Carolina State University. And crazy semester, and right now I'm just trying to stay ahead of the avalanche. So that's my introduction.
Gracias, Professor Chavez. We must be related, because I also grew up in the project. So I want to thank Olivia and Adriana and all the students putting this together. We recently had a Dale Prize, and Miguel was one of our winners. So I'm gonna do like what he did, with kind of talked about his biography by years. So that's what I'm gonna do. All right, just quickly. So I was born in Sacramento, California. I'm what race is called an anchor baby, because my mother was living in Tijuana, and she decided to cross the border while she was cleaning houses for a living in San Diego, and delivered me here. And then 40 days later, I go back to Tijuana, and I spent 4 years of my life in La Colonia Libertad, El Cañón Otay. And then after 4 years, our family, because of me, they still owe me money because of legalize their paper. I was able to allow for my family to come to LA, to Hollywood. So my extended family, when it comes to family, when the Mexicans, we don't mess around. It's not like mom, dad, son, us. It's primo, prima. So it was I have 10 uncles and aunts, 100 first cousins. And so when we moved to Hollywood, there was about 30 people living in a craftsman home. It was a 3-story. And one of my uncles was a human smuggler, and the other one was a drug dealer. At 6 years old, we moved to the projects, Ramona Gardens, housing projects, Big Hazard, in Bow Heights. It's one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in the country. If you see the movie American Me, it's based on that. When I was 10 years old, one of my homeboys means a friend, just a translation here, offered me weed. I was 10 years old, and but like Clinton, I didn't inhale, so that was good. When I was 12, my dad gave me his gun because one of the older homeboys wanted to beat him up because he pushed his younger brother. That was like my dad's backup. There was no like little league stuff, in the projects. When I was 16, a cop pulled a gun on me when I was learning how to drive. My sister gave me a 67 Mustang, and I made a rolling stop. And by the time I stopped, they pulled a gun on me and almost got killed. But I was already immune to violence because all my friends had been shot or killed or gone to jail. When I was 17 years old, I was gifted in math, and I won a calculus contest. But the people at Franklin High School, it was at Occidental College, they robbed me of my and it's like Marlon Brando, I could have been somebody because they robbed me of my award because they cheated, and later I got a little plaque, so that was disappointing. At 17 years old, a skinny kid from the projects got accepted to UCLA as a freshman math major. After 2 years of organizing at UCLA, I dropped out to become a community activist. 13 years later, I came back to UCLA to finish my bachelor's in history. And then after I went to UCLA in master's program to get my master's. My BA was under the supervision of Dr. Juan Gomez Quiñones, who recently passed away. And my master's at UCLA under the supervision of Leo Estrada, Dr. Leo, both doctors, and he passed away also recently. And then I went to UC Berkeley, where I received my Ph.D. in city and regional planning. And on the first day I got there, it was kind of funny. Because when I got there, this one white guy goes, he was in my cohort, and he goes, there was only 8 of us. He goes, oh, I didn't know that affirmative action was still legal in California. And I was like, oh, okay, it's gonna be like that. So I didn't say anything, but I didn't have any inferiority complexes or imposter syndromes. I attended UCLA, so I didn't have a problem with that. And later we became friends, so it was cool. And then I worked different places. I lectured at UCLA. And before that, I lectured at UC Berkeley. And then I ended up in 2014, I was hired at the Department of Urban Regional Planning as an assistant professor, tenure track. It took my department 50 years to hire a Mexican American, only 50 years. So I'm glad with that. So it took me a few years to get tenure. So I'm happy about that. And I think in terms of urban planning, we've been doing a better job in hiring diversity. So it's good that I'm here. I think before I got here to Cal Poly, it was a good university, but now that I'm here, it's a great university. So I'm happy to be of service. I'm just kidding. So that's a little bit of background about myself. And I do a lot of advocacy work in dealing with immigration, informal economy. And I'm a very pro-student type of professor and I'll wrap up with this. Everything that I do is the opposite of the way I was taught. Because being first generation, when I say first generation university, it's like first generation elementary school, because my parents didn't go to school, and all the way to the university. So part of me is whatever I didn't receive in terms of mentorship or advice, then I'm paying it forward. Because I didn't receive that, so now that's my role. It's like my father never said I love you or give me a hug. Those cheap Mexican hugs, it's like, so anytime I see my son, I give him a hug or I tell him I love him. So that's a little bit about myself.
Thank you, Dr. Álvaro Huerta and Professor Steven Chavez. Your brief autobiographies are probably a great segue to maybe talk about some of the challenges that you've experienced through undergraduate and graduate professional schools in the fields that have basically historically been like dominated by white people in general and white men in particular.
Yeah, so I think for me personally, I had no real racial challenges in undergraduate or graduate school. Paying student, so it's different when you're paying student, you're a paying student, so it's different than actually getting hired or getting paid. So no challenges actually, really. The only thing that I would say in terms of landscape architecture, and that is in undergrad with landscape architecture at University of Washington, no racial challenges. Ulster University for Masters in Fine Art and Photography, no racial challenge there. But in landscape architecture, much different than photography. And this goes for everybody, regardless of race. It was the workload. we kind of have this architecture and landscape architecture, this kind of culture of all-nighters, of, who works the hardest and how much assignments did you do? And, oh, I didn't sleep for 3 days in a row and stuff like that. And I found that that really does impede creativity, not getting that break and rest between things. But a huge thing, and this goes both for landscape architecture and photography, was the lack of teaching material that showed people of color, particularly people of color in the United States, their work. There's people of color from South America, there's Asian work from, from Asia and China and Japan, but there was no real work that I saw being showed and taught from people of color that live in the United States.
Yes, for me, it's we have different experiences, different trajectories. I think that sometimes racism works in a subtle way. And for me, it goes back to elementary schools. So in elementary school, all my teachers were white, even though all the students were Mexican or Mexican American. But all of them, and everybody was poor. Everybody was on welfare. We had like one white kid. It was like the token white kid. And it was cool, Glenn. They operated a store right there. And the way racism manifested itself, it was the low expectations. In other words, the teachers were really, really nice. And I had this one teacher, her name is Miss Cher. And I used to call her Miss Ronald McDonald because she had red hair, and she was really nice to me. She loved me and I loved her. And she was like the best teacher ever. But I still call her Miss Ronald McDonald. And she didn't know. But the teachers, they didn't expect the Mexican kids there or Mexican American kids to even finish high school, because not that many people finish high school in the projects. So it was never like, oh, you guys are going to go to college. That never came up. My son went to UCLA lab school because I didn't want him to experience the stuff that I went to. They have a school based on the Dewey model. And from day one, they're like, you're going to go to college, everybody. They talk about college. What do you want to be, an architect? You want to be this? But in the projects, it wasn't even considered. So you can't imagine something that doesn't exist. Like we didn't even think about college. For us, like graduating high school was like going to Harvard, or going to UC Berkeley. Like we killed a pig. It was like a quinceañera, it was a big deal, graduating high school, because nobody graduated high school. And one of the reasons why is because the high school was an a rival gang. And in junior high school, I got transferred to a white school, Sunland Tahunga, Mount Gleason Junior High School. Those were racist. On the first day, they started throwing rocks at our bus. This is like therapy for me, just so y'all know. It was like Birmingham, Alabama, people. They were throwing rocks, and they were calling us wetbacks and beaners and lowriders. And I didn't know what racism was. I knew what poverty was. I knew what violence was. So the rocks didn't bother me at all. It was like got them and threw them back. And then I was like, beaner, I didn't even think that was an insult. Like, you don't eat beans? I thought everybody ate beans, right? But that's when you start to realize that you're different. And not only are you different, but you're less than, or they treat you like you're less than. And I started off on all the gifted classes, and then in 7th grade, and by 8th grade, I was there. I wasn't sniffing paint, but I was then in the metal shop and wood shop. So that's how you get tracked. All the Mexicans were in the metal shop and wood shop. And some of the surfer kids that were more like rebellious, they used to hang out with us. So by the time I got to UCLA, I already had experienced racism, so it didn't really bother me. And then I was in, you go in with the cohort of other Chicanos and Chicanas that you create this buffer. It's like the Pachucos. You don't care, what other people think. You defend yourself and you fight back, but you don't worry about it because you're with a group of people. And by the time I got to graduate school, I did experience the racism a little bit more. It was a little bit more subtle. But sometimes it's the absence of. Right? So if you don't see other Chicano faculty, you're like you feel like you don't belong. So racism manifested that way. There was Leo Estrada, but you can't have like one token Chicano. I can't be the one token Chicano. I mean, you're not gonna have someone that's good looking as me, or funny. But other than that, somebody didn't go to Berkeley, but whatever. but I did experience it. You know, I had one advisor who passed away now. I'm not gonna say her name. She passed away, but you know, she literally just gave up on me. She's like, no, you're not gonna finish, you know. So I had to go to Leo Estrada, who was my homeboy, my mentor, who really kind of understood what I wanted to do it and what I was doing and provided that. So a lot of that racism was there was the buffer because I had somebody to go to. And same thing happened at Berkeley. And sometimes the racism, the way it works, I had the same experience once towards the end of my dissertation. And sometimes racism is not just white people, but it's other minorities. It's like women. Sometimes women have, like, if you have a women supervisor and you're a woman, sometimes the women supervisors are worse than the men. Or in the projects, when the cops are brown, they're worse than the white cops because they beat you up worse than the white cop because they want to show them that they're with the blue, right? So by the time I got to Berkeley, I experienced the same thing. And even one class I took outside of my department in sociology, I got an email from the professor said, you asked too many questions and you're not going to make it. So this always telling you you're not going to make it, like you don't belong. Be in your place, Alvaro, you know, and they even change your name. Oh, Alberto. Like, who's Alberto? Like, you don't belong. You must have snuck in somehow. But I didn't have that problem. Like, I didn't internalize it. And part of it is because I grew up in the project. So for us, it's like getting killed or getting stabbed. That's what you have to worry about, not whether a racist professor, you know, tells you you can't make it or you're not going to make it. You know, so dealing with these issues, unfortunately, because there's a hierarchy and there's a disparity within the relationship, right? So they're above you and you need the grade, so you don't say anything. So you just put up with it. It's like Cuomo harassing all these people, all these women. They can't say anything because he's the boss, you know, they'll get fired. But eventually, the way I dealt with it is 10 years later, I emailed those professors, you know, I didn't like the way you treated me. And half of them apologize and the other half are dead, so who cares what they think. But unfortunately, when you're black or brown or Native American or you're gay and everybody's straight, you know, if you're the other, then you don't, even if people don't tell you, you feel it and you sense it. Or sometimes you're in a meeting and you say something and then the white colleague says something and, oh, that's pretty good, Brad, you know. Like, didn't I just say that? Maybe I said it with an East LA accent, but I did say that. Right, so you get bypassed that way. So it manifests differently and subtly. But I'm at a point in my life where I don't really care. You know, I have tenure. I say whatever I want, and I've been in situations where other people have been yelled at, like I've been yelled at, and some students have tried to disrespect me as well. And I turn around and I tell them, if I was a white faculty member, would you talk to me that way? So I don't mess around with when it comes to bullies or racism or discrimination or homophobia. I don't tolerate any of that. And a lot of it has to do where when you're vulnerable, you accept it because you have no choice, right? Because you'll be dropped out or you won't pass the class or you'll get fired. Like I used to work for this union, this little union, SUIU. They're the ones that organize the janitors, and those. I even got assaulted there, you know. But for me, because of my experience or where I come from, and I'm very unique, even among faculty, because a lot of faculty, they're middle class. Their parents went to college, they went to high school. Their parents spoke English, you know, which is something my parents didn't do. So that's how it manifested in my case. You know. It's a little bit different here at Cal Poly for the students to experience that because we have a lot of minority students. But it's still there.
Yeah. Would you guys say your experiences were similar in professional practice, like especially the challenges of being decision makers on how landscape and cities are taught, designed, and built?
Well, I guess I would say, like, in terms of being decision makers in landscape or with land, you know, land is really about power, right? And who has power in this country? But I would say the biggest challenge I see for minorities being decision makers in landscape architecture, you know, and probably sure in urban planning as well, are the systemic obstacles. And these are these firewalls, right? You know, these firewalls of, first of all, obtaining an education, the cost of it, the time commitment of it. There aren't part-time programs, you know, in landscape architecture, mostly all full-time. And again, all-nighter type of programs where, you know, a lot of students need to work. You know, my wife went to school for journalism. She was able to work full-time and get her journalism degree. But in landscape architecture, it's not really feasible. It's very difficult to do that. So lack of flexibility, first of all, even getting into the field in the education process. And then in practice, you know, having a firm, it's sort of like the chicken before the egg. It's like, you know, they have all these minority business enterprise certifications and all this stuff you get, and you go through the whole process. But then it's like, well, we need 5 years experience and you need to have to been worked on, you know, this scale project and similar. And it's like, how do you get that unless you go and work for a white firm first for several years and then branch off and get your own practice? But for those that don't do well in working in a landscape architecture firm, whether it's just not fitting in culturally and you do your own practice, how do you even get the work in that sense? So that firewall of like, well, minimum experience, 5 years, minimum experience, this scale project that's similar, and usually only the bigger firms have that. And then in academia, it's now about PhDs, doctorates, and especially being published. And who are the publishers? You know, I think publishing houses are like 80-something% white. So how do we get our work published? You know, personally, I've tried, you know, I've put my work out there, I've emailed people, and it just hasn't happened. It doesn't happen. So those are some really big challenges I see. And also, I'm not sure if there, you know, there's ways where people can get through the education process in a different way, like say Frank Lloyd Wright, who was an apprentice and he was a technical drafter and became an architect. Tadeo Ando, self-taught. You know, why isn't that still available? You know, there's all these, like, you got to get through LAR exams, you have to have so much education credits, you got to do, you know. So what about apprenticeships? You know, why isn't that, you know, an option? I don't see that being an option now. And I think those are some biggest, really big challenges.
Yes, I appreciate, you know, learning from you, Professor Chavez, and maybe we can team up later and publish something. And I see James here, so we could do, us three can publish together and collaborate. The before I became an academic, I saw a lot of this racism, or not racism necessarily. Well, yeah, it was racism, and it is working with nonprofits. In the nonprofit world, a lot of it is dominated, like the executive directors are white. And diversity means having a female. So that's like the biggest beneficiaries of diversity has been white women, of affirmative action. So that is like the diversity. So, oh, we have, you know, white women as a director. To me, I see everybody as a human being, just for the record. So for me, it's not, if I say something, it's not like it's coming from me, but that's just the facts. Right? I'm just reporting what's out there. So I saw when I was working for Communities for a Better Environment, for example, and doing environmental justice work, all of the organizers were Mexican American. The lawyers were white, and they had offices, and the researchers were white or something other than Latino or Mexican American. And all of us who are Mexican American in Southeast Los Angeles, which is like 99% Latino and Latina, primarily Mexican American, we were all in cubicles. So you see like this hierarchy. They had offices, their pay was double than what we were paid. They had, you know, these degrees, and I didn't. So that was one of the reasons why I returned to the university, because I saw like I'm getting passed up, and so I have to get that BA or I have to get that master. So that it's kind of like as an equalizer. Education has been somewhat of an equalizer for minorities to climb up the ladder. So on a positive note, that's what I would say that. In terms of academia, it is a problem. with especially I focus a lot on Mexican Americans because I know there's Central Americans and other Latinos, but that's because that's the group that I specialize in, and those are my peeps. So at the CSU system, we have the majority of students are Latino and Latina. You know, we're talking like 40%. So all of the CSU are Hispanic serving institutions, and they get benefits with that. But when it comes to tenure and tenure track faculty, we're only at like 4%. So this is how racism manifests itself, right? It's a lot of the stuff that Professor Chavez was talking about, where, oh, you have to have a Ph.D. or you have to be published, or and it's not even just have a Ph.D. It has to be like from a Berkeley or Harvard, you know. So it becomes a situation, and this is my favorite line, and I coined it, so I'm glad it's being recorded. The way I see higher education is like mountain climbing. You know, the higher you get, the wider it gets. So by the time you're at Berkeley, you're like yodeling. You know, you're like Jewel. You have to learn how to yodel. And if you don't know how to yodel, you're not gonna make it, people. You know, because we're into rancheras and Vicente Fernandez. You know, so that's how it works. Okay. Now I'm at Cal Poly Pomona, and I'm proud of being here. So we're a part of the team. You know, so this is kind of what I see. So I'm currently involved in helping with ethnic studies and having ethnic studies implemented, you know, at the CSU, which it was, but making sure that the curricula is diversified, because I see that the curricula at our college and all colleges for that matter, with the exceptions of the Department of Ethnic and Women's Studies, are racist. If you take a literature class, for example, it's all dead white men. All of the authors. And a lot of like growing up or going to the university, being at Berkeley, taking classes on immigration, all of the authors and even the professor was white. Or you have white authors writing about Mexicans, or white authors writing about gentrification. Once again, to me, it doesn't matter, you know, the color of people's skin or who they are. We're all human beings. That's what I believe. But it's disproportionate. Or all of a sudden, then there's a conflation where I'm Mexican American, but you might have somebody from Spain come, and all of a sudden, oh, he's a Latino, let's hire him. No, he's not Latino, he's Spanish American. So it needs to be, in order to kind of deal with these issues of racism, you know, we need to be able to diversify our faculty and the curricula based on the people that are here. In this case, California, we're talking about Mexican Americans, Asian Americans, African Americans, and other ethnic groups and religious groups that have been persecuted, like Jewish Americans.
Yeah, those are really important things that I think need to get folded into the curriculum, not only in landscape architecture and our disciplines, but across the university and all schools. And, you know, just making sure that, you know, one lecture isn't focused on that and then calling it a day is essential. And, you know, there's more questions of how we can do that effectively. But I think kind of on a similar note, there's a question in the chat of, you talked a bit about mentorship, and a lot of this is about, you know, having representation and having people to look up to that look like you and sound like you, and, you know, were raised, you know, in a similar background as you. So given the important role of this kind of mentorship, particularly of mentors from underrepresented groups, how can we do a better job to provide this kind of mentorship to students?
Well, for me, I think it's more than mentorship. I think it's apprenticeship. I think it is giving opportunities, especially to people who don't have the means financially or time-wise to go through, you know, 4 or 5 year program or something like that in education. So, and that's going to come down to what the process is in terms of even being eligible to take the licensure exams and becoming a licensed landscape architect. But I don't see why people of color that are already licensed landscape architects maybe can bring in 1 or 2 apprentices and teach them on the job, and then that could be their trajectory to becoming landscape architects. I see that as way more valuable than just mentorship.
I think that's a very important question. And a lot of times, this is what makes or breaks students is having that one mentor, having that one faculty that or teacher that believes in you. Let's say you're a math major and you're a woman, and there's no women, teachers or faculty member that are mathematicians. It's difficult to overcome certain hurdles, or for a male instructor to empathize with your plight, because he doesn't understand that, like, dealing with those issues of being sexually harassed or just not having those role models. So for me, mentorship has always been something that has been important to me. And actually, I've been doing it since I was like 17 years old when I got into UCLA. It wasn't enough for me that I got into UCLA. I mentored my brother and other kids, growing up, that I wanted them to go as well. And when I got to UCLA, it was a little intimidating because I was highly gifted in math. When it came to reading and writing, I was behind. So I wasn't reading at the university level or writing. And it wasn't until I was able to reach out to one mentor, Dr. Juan Gomez Quiñones, who recently passed away. And I helped get the city of LA to honor him, to have a day of Juan Gomez Quiñones on January 28th. And if it wasn't for him, for me to be able to talk to him, because he was also from Ball Heights, and to let him know, I said, look, I went to terrible schools and didn't really have assignments. I only wrote 1 2-page paper and read one book, The Pearl. And the more I talked to him, he was like, I understand. So, I'm first generation too. And so he was able to empathize and then help me and encourage me and say, it's okay, you belong here. And allowed for me to do alternative research papers. So you review this master thesis and, to work with me, given the situation, the poor K-12 education that I received when it came to reading and writing. And that the same thing goes for the master's program with Leo Estrada. And I say this because I feel that if it wasn't for people like that, I wouldn't have made it. In America, there's this myth, is like you have to pull yourself from the bootstraps. And if you make it, it's because you're smart. And if you did, and you're a hard worker, like the Protestant work ethic. And if you didn't make it, that means you're lazy and you don't want it. You don't value education, right? I don't believe in any of that. If I made it, it was because I had a mother who believed in me, and even though she was illiterate, she sent 4 of her kids to the best universities in the world, and she never said no to me. Like anything I wanted to do, even if I wanted to join the gang, okay, mijo, and then she like te persina y todo. She never said no. Because once you tell a kid no, then they inhibit themselves. If I have a Cal Poly Pomona student, for example, say, oh, I want to go to Harvard Law, that's like, yeah, why not? Apply, go for it. Obviously, if you have a 2.5, it ain't gonna happen, people. But if you're there, it's like, why not? Why settle? Why settle? Why do our people always settle? So I always try to encourage them to think big and don't let anybody. As a mentor, I think about how I was inhibited, and I always worried when I was a kid what other people thought, and that inhibited my opportunities. Like I didn't even go to the prom because I thought, oh, they're gonna talk bad about me if I go with this girl. So I didn't. But now that I'm older, I try to tell students and mentor them to don't worry about what people think. Just you can do it. You have to apply yourself, or you have to do the X, Y, and Z, and it can be done. But overall, without faculty that look like the students that are being mentored, and it's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. If you're the only Black student in the whole college, and there's no Black faculty, and there's no Black counselors, you're going to feel alienated, and you're going to feel like you don't belong. And so a lot of times words are not enough. It's just, it has to be embodied by the people. And there's research on this where you have women faculty that are mentors to other women. Obviously, it's just not limited to women, but or other minority faculties, that it helps improve graduation with those individuals, because we become those models that they can replicate and even surpass. Why not?
Yeah, it's definitely important to acknowledge that, especially what Professor Chavez said about apprenticeship versus like mentorship. That kind of leads us to maybe any words of advice that you guys had for students as they kind of navigate through college or job searching and professional life, and what to do with what work to do that makes positive change, and how we can possibly hold these places as we are hired to like this higher standard.
Yeah, I think I don't know if it's possible to back up one question and ask the one about, do you have any words? I mean, actually, what issues are relating to anti-racism? Is it okay if I answer that one? I think that was.
Go ahead.
Yeah,
I also kind of encourage you guys to ask each other questions if you'd like.
Yeah.
For conversation.
So this question was, what issues relating to anti-racism are inherent to your discipline? How can our disciplines work together to collaborate to dismantle racism and fight inequity in the design field and the built environment? So starting with what I said earlier, land is power, right? And both Dr. Huerta and I work, urban planning, land, landscape architecture, land, and it's also wealth in this country. And so the challenge I see, therefore, is it's basically a power and wealth struggle between races. Who gets to say how land is apportioned and designed, and built, and even occupied and used. So in order to start to break down that inequality and get us people of color to have a little bit more say in what is happening, how this land is apportioned and utilized and all that, I think it really, really needs to start with not this quantitative or qualitative data or information, but straight, hard quantitative data, like doing actual numbers on how much are people of color are paying in taxes. I think Dr. Huerta talked about California, Mexican American, big tax base, and how many people say in the CSU programs or system are actually tenure track or tenured, are becoming professors. So, and then in particular in public projects, how much of those projects are going to minority firms and how much are going to white-owned firms, and especially I would say in cities like, say, San Antonio, El Paso, Albuquerque, even Los Angeles, with large minority populations, and even at some of these sites, landscape architecture sites that are surrounded by communities of color, are people actually, or minority-owned firms actually getting those projects. So I would say that, and then the same with academia, like I just mentioned, like universities that are in cities that are very, very minority, there's a large minority population of color, who's tenure track, who are professors and all that. So I think hard data needs to come out and kind of shock and kind of like, shake it up a little bit and get people to move on it, because I don't want to hear, like, personally, this, qualitative stuff of like this and, oh yeah, we could do this. To me, it's like some incrementalism that kind of gives you a few steps, and then before you know it, you're with the undercurrent washed right back to where you started. No, like, keep that the very, very quantitative data out there and keep it out there consistently, and shed light on the structural systems of racism to make some changes.
Yes, I totally agree with that. A lot of this work, the way it works, a lot of it is through networks. Like in the city planning department, for example, in Los Angeles, Half of them are from USC and the other half from UCLA. And they only hire themselves, their own. This is why you see like the Obamas of the world and Biden's, like when they produce like Supreme Court justices, they have to come from Princeton, Yale, Harvard. So they use networks in terms of like friends. A lot of it is your friends are based on this network idea of that you have similar interests. Okay, you both like music, you become friends around that. It's like Professor Chavez, like work on cars. I love cars, so we can kind of, he loves art, I love art or photography. So there's something there, right? So when you're in these networks and everybody is in that network is privileged, and when there's positions available, it goes to them. So the marginalized are left out in terms of like the higher ups, right? Let's take an example of my son's school with the UCLA Lab School. Everybody there was wealthy, all the parents, super wealthy. And there was like 5 Black families. So when they have parties, all the parents they're all Hollywood people. All of them, like Michelle Pfeiffer and the guy from the Curb Your Enthusiasm. Everybody there is white. Everybody there is from Hollywood. Everybody there is connected. And then one Black lady was asked, they invited her to be in the party. And it's like, and she goes, are there going to be any other Black people there? Like, I don't want to be the only one. And I thought about this network idea. And this is how it works. So they hire amongst themselves. They go to the country clubs or they do this. This is how, in terms of like the power structure, where it comes from. And if you're not part of that clique, if you're not part of the club, you're outside. And a lot of these things happen without us even knowing, because we're not part of that conversation.
Yeah, I agree, Doctor, with that. And that networking could be from people of color, and that power structure can come from people of color. And
right.
Like for example, like say, just example, like a city in LA, like the city of San Fernando has 83% population of Latino, Mexican American, and they have a small park project and it goes to a white-owned firm, even though the city is made up of people. The people that are actually selecting the firm are Latinos. They still pick the white firms versus any kind of firm of color, which is very frustrating, mind-boggling. Our example, recently I saw a project of a Native American cemetery being designed by a white landscape architecture firm. And that's just, for me, that is hard thing to swallow in this type of profession that I didn't have to deal with in building custom cars or even photography or anything like that. But seeing that kind of stuff makes me feel like we have a really, really, really long way to go.
No, definitely. In terms of the mentorship, or like not the mentorship, but the advice for students, what I recommend, I read a lot, and I read something that somebody said, so I won't take credit for it. And what they said is use your 20s to study, to research, to travel, to inquire, to be inquisitive, and then use your 30s to apply it. In other words, think about it in terms of stages in life. And I know this because my son's 21, and I connect with students because I deal with him all the time, especially when he wants money. It's the only time he talks to me. A lot of times you might be like 20, 21, 22, and then you feel like you don't know what to do, or you're kind of lost, or you don't have direction, and then you feel like the world's going to end. And when I tell students at that point is like, don't worry, you're still young. It's okay not to know. It's really okay. I got my Ph.D. when I was 7 years old. No, just kidding. I got it when I was like 40 something, like in my 40s. And at a time when, usually you get it like in your late 20s or early 30s. And that's because I was an organizer for a long time, and then I came back. And so I have being a planner or landscape architect or architect, it's not a straight line. it zigzags. Unless your parents own a firm or they're doctors or lawyers and they just hire you out, then it's straight line, yeah. So use your 20s for that. And it's okay not to know. It's okay to volunteer, or once the pandemic is over, if everybody takes a vaccine and wears their mask and, you know, travel, you know, go to Africa, go to Latin America, go to Pacoima. Go to Van Nuys because my sister lives there. And explore that in research and study, and in your 30s, just, you know, focus and get into the career that you want. And the last thing I would say, advice, and I know Professor Chavez wants to say something, is you have to believe in yourself. And it doesn't matter, don't care what other people think. Goes back to what I'm saying, is that if you don't believe in yourself, nobody's going to believe in yourself. Do not let anybody validate who you are. I mean, even as a faculty member, I have faculty members at Cal Poly that try to put me down. And I said, where'd you get your PhD from? Sounds like a football university to me. You know, I went to Berkeley. You have to stand up and you have to defend yourself when you're being attacked, when you're being questioned, when you're being challenged. You know, when professors are giving you a hard time, say, we're in a pandemic. Did you know that? You know I'm first generation, right? You know I have a disability and you're discriminating against me. You know that, right? So you have to defend yourself and you have to believe in yourself, and then don't let anybody invalidate who you are and your self-worth. And that's what I believe, and that's who I am, and I really don't care what people think. I don't. And that allows me to be free and to make mistakes, and that's okay, because we learn from those mistakes and you get ahead. And you have compassion for others, and you treat others with respect. I don't care if you have a PhD. I don't care if you're illiterate like my mother. We're all human beings, and we have to treat each other with dignity and respect. And that's the problem in this country, in this capitalist country, where people are valued based on their worth, based on their zip code, based on their bank account and their profession. That doesn't matter. None of that matters. Who cares if you're the most successful? I have tenure professors at UCLA who put me down, and I'm better than them because I don't treat people like that. Because I treat the president of the university, Dr. Coley, the same as I treat the janitor who cleans our offices when we're all asleep or playing Xbox. They treat them all the same with respect and with dignity. And that's what I demand of my students and my colleagues. And if they don't want to play that game, then I don't want to associate with you. And to me, this is what I love about Cal Poly Pomona, because I don't see that as a rule. I see our students are beautiful, are powerful, are smart, are driven, and they believe in diversity and inclusion. And they don't discriminate, you know, based on sexual orientation or anything like that. They embrace each other, and that's what I believe in.
Yeah, I would say those are all great points, Dr. Huerta. I would say, and that kind of segues into my advice in terms of capitalism. So I would say my advice is for students of landscape architecture to start outside of landscape architecture, because I think landscape architecture is just a symptom of a much larger problem. You know, so and you can call me a socialist, whatever you want to call me, but I think we need to start with a universal basic income to give people freedom of choice, and also universal health care. So that way, and I'm not talking about some basic income where you're going to be driving around in a Porsche, or in the case of me or Dr. Huerta, a couple of 63 Impalas. So no, I'm just talking about a basic income, because not everybody wants to strive to have 5 cars and a big house and all that. They like their time, and they want to do art, or they want to do design, and they want to do things like that. And that, to me, is more freedom. And that gives you choices. That gives you a choice if you want to start your own practice. You don't have to go work for a large multidisciplinary firm to make a certain amount of money so you could pay your rent and have health care. So I would say start outside of landscape architecture, because landscape architecture is pretty small. It's a symptom of a much bigger problem. And then think about then starting your own practice, making sure that work gets done, especially in communities of color, and by firms that are led by firms of color. That would be my advice outside of landscape architecture.
Thank you. Thank you. I think the words of advice are really great and encouraging. I know we're at time right now, 6:01, but I was hoping if you guys had time for one more question. If you guys are okay with that?
Yeah, I'm okay with that.
Okay, so the last question is, how can we create just places as designers? Built environments where people feel like they matter. They can be their whole selves and feel safe. What does an equitable public space or city or just city look like to you?
So for me, just an equitable places actually start where they are located. It's an equal distribution of landscape spaces, landscape public parks, plazas, things like that, throughout the city and throughout the region, equally distributed, not some one large grand project that caps the LA River that creates gentrification in one spot, but maybe there are smaller urban acupuncture type of installations or installments or interventions throughout the city. So it really does start with, making sure that every part of the city or the region is getting its fair share of public spaces. And then it's, going back to photography and taking photographs of everyday landscapes and then coming back and say visiting places like Tonga Park where everything's hyper stylized, crazy expensive. Like maybe all we really need to do for communities is to kind of create the scaffolding, thinking about like with education or experience, like making sure these places are healthy, that they're safe, for health, safety, and welfare, all the standards that we need to know, guardrails, all that kind of stuff. But let the community really work in terms of inputting and shifting as the culture shifts for their places. So they create the sense of place, you create the scaffolding, and that shifts over time. And so those are, that's what I would say in terms of that question. But really starting with just equitable places are really where they're located.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I just copying notes. So tomorrow in my lecture, I'm gonna plagiarize Professor Chavez here. So I'm glad it's being recorded because I can get it right. I believe strongly in this idea that planning, architecture, landscape architecture needs to start from the ground up. It needs to start from the community members versus what exists today. It's top down. Once planning schools, and I'm sure architect, they're probably about the same time. Like Harvard was the first one, like in the 30s, and like design schools, and you start to see others in the United States. It was this idea that they were more technical, they're technocrats, and they learn these hard skills and the scientific method. See, I do know something. Putting the Ph.D. to use. And especially in the 50s, that there are administrators, bureaucrats, and people with these degrees, these masters and all certifications that created a class that knows best, like the father knows best. It's like in the 50s, the dad knows best, and it's going to tell the children what to do and tell the wife what to do. It's like, I'm the educated one, I'm the certified planner, I'm the one that has the degrees, I'm the landscape architect, and I'm going to design the cities that are good for you, because I know what's good for you because I'm educated and I went to Cal Poly Pomona and the best architecture and landscape programs in the nation. And because I come from these places and I have the certificates, then I'm going to design your cities in my imagination. Because my degree my certificates allows me to do that, versus the other way, upside down, up from the ground up. what I believe that we should listen to community members and reimagine cities based on their stories, based on their life experience, and based on their values. I get tired of people like from Harvard. I've been picking on Harvard a lot because probably because they didn't give Cornell West tenure.
Yeah.
My cousin.
Mhm.
I get tired of, well, he makes like 10,000 a speech. They give me like 10. When I give a speech, I get paid in tacos. I get tired of people from Harvard. They go to the Skid Row, and because they're from Harvard, or like these people in University of Chicago that went to the hood in the 50s, and then they categorize, and then they create these images, and they tell us what people from the hood need, or people from Skid Row need. And they put in these fancy reports and all that. All you have to do is you go to these communities, or you go to these spaces, and you ask them, what do you need? And they'll tell you. And they'll tell you exactly what they need. Right? So we just have to listen to people like the Native Americans, just listen and learn and practice and work together in conjunction with those of us who have these hard skills, these soft skills. Bring the community as part of stakeholders to design cities together, to plan cities together, and rural communities, and so on and so forth. Because they're the ones that live there. Because we design them and then we leave. We're not from there, so and it's different. It's like a cookie cutter approach that planning takes, for example. But it's different planning in little Tokyo versus planning in Boyle Heights versus little Saigon. There's different cultures, different languages, different customs. So we have to learn and educate ourselves and learn from them that they too have knowledge. They too have knowledge to teach us. And they don't need degrees because they have lived experience, and they know what it is to live in overcrowded housing. They know what it is to not have a good public transportation because they rely on it, because they depend on it. So my vision is to do that hard work, is to plan long-term, but with the community at the forefront, and us working together in putting our skills into practice. So that's what I believe.
Yeah, thank you so much for those. Everything you have said tonight has it's so much learning, and from basic minimum income to rethinking just the fabric of how we design and how we plan, and all of that is, I think there's a big shift that's hopefully happening now, and these kinds of conversations are so important to that and to making sure that these kinds of changes take place. And I don't want to close it out. I feel like we could have 5 of these conversations and still have more questions to ask, but I guess I'll kind of close things up by giving you guys a huge thank you for everything you've shared with us tonight, your experiences and your perspectives, and just your voices are so valuable. And I know I've learned a lot, and I hope everybody here has. And I'm just really grateful that we've had the chance to spend the past hour with you. And like I said, these conversations are not always easy, but they're super essential to providing, guidance and perspective to all of us who are really actively trying to work to change the fabric of the fields that we're in, and, academics. So I just want to say, if there's any other kind of closing thoughts or comments that either of you would like to say before we say goodnight, feel free.
I just want to say thank you to everybody for putting this together. I know, Rennie, Lauren Bricker, you, Olivia, Adriana, everybody else that helped put this together. And that's basically all. Just much thanks to you guys for doing that.
I'm going to thank everybody in Spanish. Muchas gracias. Yes, thank you all, especially the students. I know that it's hard to be a student right now, and for you to do this extra work and to have support of your beautiful and wonderful faculty to make sure that they're in your corner. I think that's fantastic. So to me, I believe in young people. I believe in middle-aged too, because I'm middle-aged. They're the ones that stopped the war in Vietnam. They're the ones that are leading the way with Black Lives Matter. So you guys and gals and y'all are leaders, and so we need to appreciate you and work, come together and make this place a better place. And I really appreciate that our dean is here, because I need a raise, and she's very supportive of our efforts, and it just makes me feel good, that we're going. I feel, and not I don't feel, I believe that we're going in the right direction, to making this a better colleges, a better and more inclusive college, and an example for the other colleges, the lesser colleges, to follow.
Yes, thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Lauren Bricker, and of course our guest, Dr. Álvaro Huerta and Professor Steven Chavez once again. We truly appreciate this.
Wonderful program. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Hi, everyone.